So today I will be talking, unsurprisingly, about Jordan Peterson, as the title implies. And I'm actually not going to be critiquing him per se. And there are many acolytes of Jordan Peterson that are always quick to rise to his defense. You will know who you are, of course, the infallible God King Peterson. But I want to point some things out about how he's approaching certain matters. And specifically, I want to talk about his message of individual sovereignty. Now, grossly speaking, I agree with him. I believe in the sovereignty of the individual. I'm an individualist by nature. It is how I evolved as a person due to whatever interaction my genome had with the environment. That's just how I am. But one thing that Peterson himself notes, and you'll listen to this in a clip shortly, is that the doctrine or the idea of individual sovereignty is not well represented throughout the world. And in fact, if you really look at the notion of individual sovereignty, it's very isolated. It's isolated to Europe primarily, but even more specifically to a very particular Anglo-American tradition. Now, you can speculate as to the reasons for why this is the case. Some would say it's all genetics, other people say it's all cultural. It's obviously going to be some mixture of both. We can definitely say, I think, with some certainty that the Protestant Reformation had a lot to do with that. The destruction of hierarchies and certain structures that were in place allowed for the development of the individual, whereas in Southern Europe and strict Catholic hierarchies, you didn't see that. And to the best of my knowledge, you don't see that type of philosophy, that framework of mind represented anywhere else in the world. Maybe it is, and I'm just ignorant. But at least looking at other cultures from East Asia to the Middle East, to Africa, Native American traditions, you don't really see that degree of hyper-individualist thought. And whatever the ultimate ideology of this might be, and I think that's an interesting subject in itself, and it should be studied, it's something that Peterson needs to make more clear when he's speaking on these matters. Now, recently Peterson had a discussion with Majid Nawaz, this Pakistani Muslim reformer, talking about Islam and what potential problems it might pose, etc., etc. And he's asked the question, as you see in this clip, that is, Majid asked the question of Peterson, what his thoughts on Islam are. Now, Peterson's very careful when he speaks. He says, I don't know enough about it, but it's not clear to him that all cultures necessarily lead to the type of social democracy, and I'm not personally endorsing social democracy, his words, that you see in the West. So let's listen to that, and then we can move along with our analysis.
One of the great political footballs of our times, and the way which involves the left, let's say the populist left as well as the populist right, is the question of Islam in the West. You've described yourself as a nominal Christian, and then you describe yourself as speaking to somebody who is openly identifies as a Muslim. Where do you stand in this great question of Islam in the West, the role of Muslims in the West, integration, extremism, and some of the challenges around the values such as free speech? I'm thinking, for example, blasphemy and the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France, and all of the issues that arise from that, including, for example, some of the populist left's perhaps defense of some of these issues in the favor of Islamist Muslims, and some of the populist right's animosity towards the presence of Muslims in the West. Have you thought much about this question?
Yeah, but not enough. Because it's a question that to answer properly, I have to know a lot more about Islam than I know. But here would be my questions. Okay, first of all, I'm not willing to assume axiomatically that all belief systems are commensurate with Western democracy. And the reason I'm not willing to assume that is because there are hardly any Western democracies. So the belief systems of most of the world aren't commensurate with Western democracy. So the rule of thumb shouldn't be, well, people from all cultures are just as likely to support Western democratic ideals. It's like, no, obviously not, because those ideals only are present in a tiny minority of countries. We don't know how they got to be present there. Now, I would suggest that some of that has to do with the Judeo-Christian emphasis on the sovereignty of the individual, but also more technically maybe in Christian societies on the division between the church and the state. Now, and that's a division that isn't formally expressed in Islam. And so I don't know, I have a hard time conceptualizing Islam because I can't figure out if it's fundamentally religious or if it's fundamentally political. Or maybe it's an amalgam of both in a manner that it's not easy for a Westerner to identify. Mm-hmm. So I have some sympathy towards people who are curious about whether Islam has a tilt towards totalizing, like other doctrines have a tilt towards totalizing. And I would say the evidence for that is that it isn't obvious that Islamic countries have been able to give rise to sustainable Western-style democracies with fundamental emphasis on individual rights and responsibilities. Mm. So it's an open question. But, you know, the people tend to think, well, the ethic, the individual rights / responsibility ethic of the West is somehow self-evident and it's agreed upon by people broadly throughout the world. It's like, I don't see it that way. I don't think that's the case. Now, the way forward, as far as I'm concerned, is to begin the process of the various serious discussions that are necessary between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, essentially, because I do believe this is fundamentally a religious issue, about how those systems of belief are commensurate, whether they can coexist in the same space, how that might be negotiated, what that would mean theologically and metaphorically. And, you know, that dialogue, I don't think that dialogue has even really begun.
So it's obvious that Peterson's aware of these differences in the world. Cultures, he thinks it's mostly a religious issue. It is obviously partly a religious issue. And I'm not sure if the umbrella term Judeo-Christian tradition answers the question of why hyper-individualist philosophy emerged in the Anglo-American tradition. But nonetheless, he's aware that it's not well subscribed to throughout the world. Now, at the same time, Peterson has relentlessly preached this message of individual sovereignty, the individual taking responsibility for himself and getting things done. And I can fully endorse that. But the real question that needs to be asked openly is, what do you do when 95% of the world is not on board with that message? He can preach all he wants about the greatness of the individual and individual's philosophy and personal responsibility, which is effectively a type of libertarian message. But we have to ask the question, whom does libertarianism resonate with? And why are the numbers always so small? It's not something that most people get on board with. Most people in the world and in the countries where these philosophies were best represented, that is, Anglo-American countries, they subscribe to a more collectivist philosophy. They believe in group identity more. They believe more in identity politics. And Peterson is very, very quick to decry identity politics, and I would too. There's something in my own mind, at least, at its core, that fundamentally rejects identity politics. I'm not interested in participating in it. In fact, every time I think about it, it makes me feel icky, or as if there's something fundamentally wrong with it. I'm not saying there is, it's just my own personal emotional projection of that, I suppose you could say. But if everyone is playing a certain game and you're not, you're going to run into problems. It's a kind of skewed prisoner's dilemma, where you're offering to approach the situation from a completely different perspective. If you are going to engage in honorable principles and interacting with people, and you don't want to haggle your way through everything, and you're looking at everyone from an individual perspective, and nobody else is doing it, there are very few, well, you're probably going to end up going down with your principles. You're probably going to end up drowning in a vast sea where no one else really cares about your principles. And I've yet to see Peterson adequately address this problem. If he's aware of the fact that most of the world does not buy into the Anglo-American tradition of individualist philosophy and personal responsibility, and, at least to a lesser degree, identity politics, where's his evidence that his message is actually going to resonate with people and the people he encounters? I don't see the evidence for that. The fact that he's willing to say that, at least partially, that he doesn't see the evidence in other traditions necessarily, means that he's at least partly aware of it. I'm not really sure what you do in a situation like that. I'd like to think that I would stick to my principles and go down with the ship. That might be a particularly ignoble death on my part. And I'm even of the inclination to think that Peterson will go down with the ship too, that his quote-unquote noble message of individual responsibility and the sovereignty of the individual will fall on deaf ears to 90% of the world, and he will be swallowed up by people who are engaging in heavy identity politics. I find it interesting, too, that he's willing to blatantly ignore the identity politics of some of his best friends and closest allies, in addition to this. But it's definitely a very palatable message. It sounds great. But the question you must pose is, if the vast, vast majority of people are engaging in identity politics and you're not willing to, what do you do? We have to acknowledge that most people are tribal. Most people from most cultures in the world don't believe in the sovereignty of the individual. And look at the way groups, even in traditionally Anglo-American countries, vote. They don't vote as individuals. They tend to vote as groups. It's obvious. You can look at the data. It's why political groups in the United States aggregate data and they talk about the black vote or the Hispanic vote or the white vote or whatever. There definitely are trends. Those trends represent, of course, just means. They don't represent individuals per se in those groups, but there's that tendency. And these days, unfortunately, identity politics really is king. And Peterson is pushing back against that. But I just don't see the audience for it. Sure, he's willing to get certain groups of young men on board who are willing to listen to the message, but it's always been the same story with libertarianism and what have you. It's always been a group of primarily young men of a certain background or bent who are most susceptible to that message, and the vast majority of other people are not. So I don't really know a good answer to this dilemma. Does one throw one's lot in with the identitarians? I would probably never do that myself because it doesn't appeal to me. I feel it goes against my principles, and I probably would go down with the ship. But if you want to get anything done, and you want to do more than just rattle off sound bites that sound particularly noble and enlightening to people, well then, in that case, it poses a serious problem as to what can be done about this reasonably. It might be that the vast majority of people who don't subscribe to identitarian philosophy will have to fold and engage in the politics of identitarianism. Again, that's not a personal endorsement of it. It's just when 90% of the world, or the majority of the world, is doing that, you risk being eclipsed and swallowed up by that. And, of course, what I talked about in a more recent video, which incidentally was demonetized for probably pretty obvious reasons, the consequentialist appeal that he makes doesn't resonate with people. People don't think, oh, right, collectivism leads to these horrible things happening. They don't think about it. It just sounds cool when he says that, but they're not actually thinking about the real-world impact of what he says, because they just mindlessly engage in the collectivist identity politics that he despises and thinks are so dangerous. I am viewing this as an open-ended question, and I think he states as much as well, and the conversation absolutely must be had. But it might be the case that the Anglo-American tradition of individual sovereignty is fundamentally irreconcilable with most cultures in the world, and indeed most people coming from these cultures. And if that's the case, then what do you do other than engage in a never-ending back and forth of identity politics? I hope that's not the case, and we certainly can't be sure, but there seem to be indications of that. I didn't really want to make this video too long, so I think I will leave it there. It's an open-ended question, but it's something that Peterson needs to talk more about, that there might be fundamental incompatibilities between cultures and peoples around the world, and that not everyone is willing to get on board. Many people are going to be tribal, and they will be tribal until they die. So how do you promote this message of individual sovereignty to a world that for most of its history has never really supported that idea and never even witnessed that idea until comparatively recently? I do not know. With that said, I wish you a pleasant weekend. I'll check you out later, presuming I'm still alive. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.